Okay, and today we're in chapter 5 of Galatians. We have just finished in chapter 4 the beautiful allegory that Shaul has spoken to us. I hope that that particular teaching blessed you, because that was like the core of Galatians. That was a very central message of Galatians. I hope that it sunk in, that you understood what it's all about, because that's what Shaul has been bringing us to. That allegory simply was an illustration, really, of his theology. It's a notoriously difficult allegory for people to understand, but as we have been studying together for weeks, I was able to break it down for you, and I think everybody walked away having understood perfectly what Shaul has been saying. So now we're in chapter 5 of Galatians, and as we heard that allegory, Shaul continues his teaching on the topics of freedom and slavery, and delves into a couple of issues about the fruit of the Spirit towards the end of the chapter. So let us read chapter 5, verse 1, and I'll explain a few concepts that I want you to see right there that are important, so we can move on properly. So chapter 5, verse 1. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore keep standing firm, and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Very simple words. I don't think it's hard for people to comprehend what it's saying here. Messiah has set us free for freedom. What is this freedom, is the question. How do people define freedom? Well, remember the illustration of Hagar and Sarah, that allegory we studied. It's just proceeding to this. Hagar is Sinai. She's not free, because Torah is her guardian, limiting her freedom, regulating her behavior in every way. So that's why she's not free. Her children are not ready to live for God in a mature way. Her children are not free also. They need the rules. They need some enforcement in their lives. They're not quite ready yet. Freedom is maturity. A state when person does not have to be coerced to make the right decisions. Does not need to be guided. He does what is right because he has a proper attitude, he has a proper understanding. So understand freedom as a symbol of maturity, and understand the lack of freedom or slavery as that sign of that immaturity, that needing a guardian, needing a tutor, needing a teacher, needing to be held by the hand and given particular instructions. So in the verse 1, what we're reading is Shaul says to Galatians not to be subject to a yoke of slavery. Messiah set you free. He set you free so that you can be free, and don't be subject to the yoke of slavery again. And it's very easy to see through the ruse in this verse, that people put this ruse into this verse very often. The traditional Christian explanation of this verse, I'm sure you've heard it, that slavery, of course, is the Torah. And Messiah came to set us free from the Torah. Right? That's what you've probably heard preached a few Sundays ago, right? If you went. Well, it all makes sense if you hear this explanation, but there's a stubborn word, again. That word, again, will not go away. It's in the original text, it's there, and you can't take it out. So here's the ruse. You cannot be in slavery to something again if you've never been in slavery to something before. Catch it? You can't be in slavery again if you haven't been in slavery before. Here's the question. Galatians, were they ever enslaved under Torah? No. So they can't be free from that to which they were never enslaved to. They were enslaved under sin. Shaul has taught about that quite a bit. He talked about the natural elements, remember? The natural flow of the world, the disobedient human nature that rules us on the inside. They lived as a part of a system. The system of worshiping idols, making offerings and loyalty to things that they themselves did not understand. Shaul spoke about this earlier. Now they can, in a sense, go back to being a slave. In the same way that they were slaves to these things before, they can return to them. This time they will be trading their idolatry system for another system, for Torah, which can affect them in the same way. Listen to me for a second. It can make them not free, by offering a simple system, a routine, upon which they can rely. It becomes a routine. You stop trusting God and start trusting in the things you do. It is simple to see that slavery cannot stand for Torah here, logically, but if one understands that Galatians did not know Torah until they actually met Shaul. That's about the only time that Torah actually entered into their lives, is when this Jewish teacher showed up and started teaching them about these things. Prior to that, they were idolaters. There's no synagogue in their town. They can't possibly know about these things very much. So no, slavery is something entirely different in our lives. If you read the previous chapters, you would know, if you read it carefully, that Shaul talked about this stoicheia, the elementary powers, the fundamental principles of the world. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about Galatians being enslaved to them. Galatians are not supposed to become a part of the system of the world, to follow the natural pattern of life as they did before. You see, they were born and they lived in the natural way as they were born. Nothing has entered their life to alter it until Messiah came, and all of a sudden they entered a supernatural life. But prior to that, they just functioned as everybody else did. So a well-built system can be very dangerous because it can mislead people into a false sense of spirituality and thinking that they're in a good place with God. There are many religious people in this world who think that they're in a good place with God. Why? Because they follow the system. They do the right things with the right frequency, in the right way, and they're very meticulous about observing the system, but they don't have a relationship with God. In reality, they trust the system and actually do not wish to know God, because God might bring in some changes that don't go with the system. So a well-built system actually can be very dangerous. Torah can become this pattern. Torah can become this system. It can become means to an end. That's what can happen. And that is why Shaul's here sounds a little caution. See, the Galatians at this point rejected the idolatrous system that they followed before, and now they are interested in embracing another system because it's easy to follow the system. Well, so Shaul is offering something else. Shaul is saying that this system that you're trying to embrace is not characterized by freedom. You need to enter into maturity. You need to be the kind of person who chooses to live for God and does not need fences, because that's what Torah does. Torah, God puts fences in our lives, and it kind of guards us and safeguards us from when we're not mature, to know that what we should do and how we should live. So that's why we see the word again here. Again means that they are deciding to come back living under the pattern, living by the scheme, relying on the system. And that's what he means by, do you again want to be enslaved? Yes, now the entity is different, but the result is the same. They're not going to be free. Their freedoms are going to be limited by the system which they themselves are imposing on themselves. So this brings us into verse 2 and on. I'm going to read 2 through 6. I know the first verse took a little bit of time to explain, but we'll go a little bit faster now. Verses 2 through 6. And I'm reading from New American Standard. Behold, I, Paul, say to you, that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. And I testify again, every man who receives circumcision, that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. You have been severed from Christ. You who are seeking to be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith working through love. So I'm going to stop right there and go over several of these verses. There's a lot of stuff packed in there. So Shaul says something pretty amazing here. It says that if Galatians receive circumcision, Messiah will be of no benefit to them. This is a warning. It's supposed to be stern. He's trying to deter them. Why is he saying this? Because we already understand his theology a little bit. We understand that Galatians, in particular Gentiles, and Shaul's view of the world and how things are being fulfilled in his lifetime actually play a very important role. For him, Gentiles are supposed to stay Gentiles to be the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. Right? That's his theology. That's what he's thinking about. So for him, it's very important. And usually when people read these words in verse 2, they kind of twist them a little bit. And the twisting usually goes along the lines that the Galatians are somehow not saved anymore, they're backslidden, or some other similar nonsense to that. You know, you receive the circumcision, you have no benefit in Messiah. You lose that. So you get circumcised, basically you're not saved anymore. That's how people try to twist it. And remember, Shaul is not talking about salvation here, by the way. The entire letter, this entire letter that we're studying has nothing to do with salvation here at all. And don't let anybody ever to insert the topic of salvation into these verses. Because what he's talking about a path of a pagan who becomes a proselyte, to God. He already described two different paths, really. He described the natural path and the supernatural path. And this is not about salvation per se, this is about identity. It's about which path do you follow, meaning which group you belong to. So it's about identity, not salvation. It's about the process, really. And it's about where you yourself plug into that there's two ways, the two ways that we talked about earlier. So what Shaul really says, that if they choose a different path to God, meaning circumcision, and by the way, for Shaul, circumcision is a legitimate path, they are rejecting Messiah's offer. That's what he's saying. They're denying what he has already done for them. Remember, that's how it begins. That's how the entire letter of Galatians begins. Do you now want to be perfected by flesh? You began in the Spirit, you had this amazing experience with the Spirit of God, and now you want to be perfected through the flesh, through your own natural efforts? See, that's how he begins the letter, that's how he continues. That thought just keeps coming back. In a sense, he's saying that if you take circumcision, if you go this route, you will not benefit from what Yeshua has done for you. And for you, this is an intentional step. You know what Yeshua has done for you. You've experienced the fullness. You've experienced the Spirit. And now you're wanting to back away from it. You will have no benefit from this. See, that's the problem of a different path. But instead, basically, they're deciding to reach the same goal through a different path. And that's what Shaul is very uneasy about, and that's what he warns them about, that this different path is not the same that they've been on before. And changing it has problems with it. He cautions them from changing this path because it is a much harder path. It's a much more difficult path. It's a path that they would probably not be able to follow themselves, which is some of the points he makes. So in verse 3, Shaul here warns Galatians that if they become circumcised, meaning they will become full converts to Judaism, we're not talking about some surgery here. We're talking about a symbolic action of changing your identity from a pagan, from a Gentile, to a full Jew, a convert to Judaism. You're saying your people will be my people. You're saying it in a very profound way. You're changing your orientation, your group. You have entirely new loyalties now. So if they become full converts to Judaism, he says you are accountable for the entire Torah. You're accountable for all the commandments. So that's a lot. 613. If you haven't been following any, to do all 613 is not an easy task. If you grew up, if you were raised in following many of the commandments, you'll have trouble following all 613 well. But if you grew up with none, how about mastering 10? That would be a tough one as it is. So this is what he's warning them. He's saying, look, you become full proselytes, you become full Jews, you convert to Judaism. You are liable for the entire Torah now in your life. Circumcision will change your status. You will legally be Jewish, and you will be accountable for all the stipulations of the covenant that God made with Israel. And this is not a gimmick, this is a real thing. That's why he says these stipulations are real, Torah is real. Guess what? There are punishments for not following those commandments. Remember, he talked about the curse, that the Torah has the curse. Shaul has spoken about this idea that Torah has a curse, and here this idea returns again. I will submit to you that he once again is talking about that, hey, this path that you're thinking about going on, it has some difficult hurdles to overcome. You think you're going to be responsible for all the commandments in the Torah? Well, by making a formal proclamation that you're Jewish, by changing your status, you are making yourself 100% obligated, and now you're going to be under a curse. You're putting yourself under the threat of punishment that previously you didn't have. But why would you do that? Because you have the fullness of God's blessing. You have His Spirit in your life. Why would you try to gain the same end result by going a different path? That's what he's talking to them about. That's why he's a little bit passionate, if you can say, by trying to deter them with such stern words. So right now, by the way, Galatians are presumably following several commandments, not all of the commandments, something similar to the laws of Noah. We talked about the B'nai Noach earlier. We talked about the laws of Noah, the 7 laws that Judaism believes that everybody should be following in the whole world. That's what Gentiles who are deemed righteous in Jewish tradition supposed to be doing. So there are several laws that they're supposed to be following now. They're sons of God, just as Noah was, but just not Jews, so they have a relationship. If they become circumcised, they take the natural path. They take the path of the proselyte. They say it's not supernatural to become circumcised. Remember, that's what Shaul talks about. Supernatural is that the Spirit comes upon them regardless of their condition. In all of their sin and separateness from God, God's Spirit comes to them supernaturally and they become revived. That's a miracle. You see, it's not a miracle to get circumcised and slowly start adhering to Torah and get closer to God that way. That's a natural path. So he says, wait, there's this natural path of the proselyte who will become Israelite, and then there's a supernatural path. So, but if they take this natural path, they're going to be under the authority of the entire Torah, because now Torah becomes their tutor, becomes their trainer, becomes their guide, and now they have to answer to everything. So that's a problem. Shaul's argument is very convincing here. You can be sons of God without becoming Jews, he says. Stay in the supernatural path, the path of promise, and through Messiah, you will gain the same status as Israel has. You will be sons. If you follow the natural path, the circumcision, you will only be saying that Messiah is not important. It will be also putting yourself under the authority of Torah. So you're denying what Messiah has done for you. You're choosing your own path, regardless of the path that he has offered you in his favor and his grace. So verse 4. You who would rather gain righteousness, he says, without Messiah, by being the way that you're trying to be, you are cutting Messiah off from yourself, and you are being cut off. You are rejecting God's favor. In Shaul's understanding, God has given Galatians a great favor, something they simply did not deserve. I mean, we talked about the idea of grace earlier on, and I don't like word grace because it's so theologized and people use it in every kind of way they possibly can, but it's not always true. So that's why I like to replace the word grace with the word favor. It kind of rings a little bit true because it doesn't have the theological baggage for most people. So favor is something that you don't really deserve, but God gives it to you. You haven't earned it, and he's just saying, hey, I have a gift for you, I have a present. Wait a minute, why are you having a present for me? I don't have a present for you, but that's okay. I have favor upon you. I like you. I want to do something nice for you. So God has favor upon them. He showed a very positive disposition towards them, regardless of their state. They're undeserving. That is a merited favor. So he's offered them a way to become his family. They're becoming a family through Messiah. And they're rejecting that favor by choosing a different way. There is a different way. But they're rejecting the supernatural way and going for the natural. So they themselves, in a sense, are cutting themselves off from the Messiah. They're cutting themselves off from what he's offering. Let's see. Shaul here speaks in plural we, by the way. Did you notice that? In verse 5, he says we. Sometimes he breaks into we. So this is plural. Probably means himself and his companions who are writing this letter with him. If you remember reading in the beginning of the letter that Shaul is the one who's writing the letter, yet he says this is not just for me, it's also from those who are with me. So it's him and his companions probably. And Shaul says that him and others who are with him, who are like him, who think like he does and believe what he does, they wait for the hope of righteousness. Did you see that? They wait for the hope of righteousness. This righteousness is not something they can attain themselves. They're waiting for it. They are hoping to receive it. The verdict of being acquitted is based on trust and reliance on God. We talked about righteousness earlier, and I'll reiterate this again, because righteousness is not holiness, it's not perfection, it is simply a status of being forgiven, pardoned, acquitted. As you stand before the judge and you know you're guilty and you know you have that ticket in your hands, but the officer doesn't show up, so guess what? You get away and you are acquitted. Doesn't mean you haven't done the crime, doesn't mean you don't deserve the punishment, but you just got lucky. favor was towards you, and whatever, made your accuser not show up, the judgment was in your favor. You were acquitted, even though you're guilty. So that's righteousness. That's being justified. That's being made right in the eyes of the law. Legally, you are justified, even though, technically speaking, you're still guilty. And that's the way we stand with God. Technically speaking, we're guilty of all kinds of things, yet He chooses to bestow righteousness upon us because of His great mercy for us. So this is us, hoping for righteousness. He says we hope for righteousness. We're waiting. We're waiting that this is going to happen to us. And we trust and we rely upon God because we know that righteousness doesn't come actually from us. So it's a lot easier, by the way, friends, to take matters into our own hands and start working hard on attaining the standard of righteousness that God has. We do have God's standard of righteousness given for us. We do have Torah. So we know exactly what He expects. It's very easy to just kind of get busy and try it really, really hard. But that is a lesser way, Shaul says. That is actually a lesser way. In light of what Galatians experienced, in light of God's Spirit presence in their lives, this path that they're following seems like a reverse course for them. So they've already gone so far, and now they're backtracking. But one can try achieve righteousness himself, or accept the fact that it's not achievable, and just wait on God and accept that it is a gift, really. Do the best, but trust in God to supply that which is lacking. Doesn't mean you stop trying. Doesn't mean you do not try to follow the things that God has given us. You do your best, but you realize that in all your best, you will still be coming up short. You will still be lacking. So what you're trusting God to do is to supply that which you are not able to give. Yes. You don't have what it takes. So He takes the what it takes and fills that in. So you can trust in yourself or trust in God. And that's basically what Shaul is talking about. So, and then in verse 6, we see the words that are often twisted again. Usually they're twisted, of course, to mean something they absolutely do not. He talks about circumcision. Circumcision, uncircumcision, what matters, what doesn't matter. He does not say here that circumcision is pointless. I want you to notice. It is God's commandment. I know most of the time people say, "Oh, you see, circumcision and circumcision doesn't matter. It's pointless. It's all it's all the same." Well, it is God's commandment. If it's pointless, why did God give it? Number one. If it's pointless and useless, then it was all for nothing for Abraham. If it's pointless and useless, then Shaul circumcised for nothing too. And of course, what he did to Timothy is also for nothing, because remember, he circumcised him. So that is not his point, actually. It's not a waste of time. He's not dismissing circumcision or its purpose in these verses. What he's doing is he's emphasizing a priority of trusting God for righteousness, not trusting your status for righteousness. Circumcision is a status, you see. So to trust in circumcision means to trust in your status with God. What he's saying is, it's nothing. The status is nothing. What you need to do is concentrate on your relationship with God. That's really what's important. So he is not dismissing circumcision. He is emphasizing the priority of trusting God over your status. Although it appears as he's dismissing circumcision, he actually is not. So what he's doing here is he's exaggerating. And remember, I told you Jews, we're prone to exaggeration. It's very normal. It's part of culture. Jews exaggerate. It's an inextricable part of Jewish culture.
Drama.
Some of you are laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
What Shaul is saying in this verse 6 is that it's not the status of a Jew or non-Jew that determines our standing before God. That's what he's saying. This whole talks about circumcision and non-circumcision. It's all about faith and faithfulness working through love. Faith and faithfulness working through love. One has to trust God to bring true righteousness. One has to rely on Messiah's faithfulness, that it works on our behalf to give us pardon, to allow us exoneration before God. That is faith working through love. See, God's love is towards us. He sends His Son in His love so that we can be exonerated, acquitted, pardoned because of what His Son has done. Not because of what we have done. So the point is to trust in Him and His doing, His faithfulness. Remember we talked about this whole faithfulness of Messiah? Remember there's faith in Messiah and faithfulness of Messiah. We talked about it for quite a bit. Why was I stressing it so much? Was so that we can understand that what Shaul, in his theology and his understanding of how things work, that it's not our belief in Messiah, it's his faithfulness that actually accomplishes that which we have in our life. The presence of God in our life is only because he was faithful. Because if it was up to us, certainly we wouldn't be. So these things are accomplished through him. And I know it's hard for us to accept because this is a gift. This is something unmerited. And we always want to kind of be involved in the process. We want to be a part of it. We want to work it. And that's why it's so hard. It's our human nature. All right, so good. Let's keep moving on. Verses 7 through 12. I'm going to read those and make a few comments. Verse 7 says, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion did not come from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. I have confidence in you, in the Lord, that you will adopt no other view, but the one who is disturbing you will bear his judgment, whoever he is. But I, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? And the stumbling block of the cross has been abolished. I wish that those who are troubling you would even mutilate themselves." Wow, you see, he's getting a little bit testy here, right? Verse 7, 8, and 9. Shaul basically says the Galatians were progressing in faith normally. They're moving along. They're running along. It's an idiom. Why would they get sidetracked? By who's doing? Who is confusing them? He says that what they believe today does not come from God who called them. Did you notice that? What you're embracing did not come from him who calls you. Remember in the beginning, Shaul, in the beginning of this letter, Shaul describes Galatians as being called by God. God called them in their condition, in their state. And as he called them, he brought them closer to himself. And so the one who calls them obviously is God. And the way he called them is in their unrighteousness, in their distance from him, in their not understanding of what holiness and righteousness even is. And so if they were called in this way, in favor and in mercy, why are all these demands of adherence to a code now? If they receive the full blessing of God, meaning the presence of the Spirit in their life, because in that condition, how can this now come with strings attached? See, that's the rhetoric that Shaul uses. He says, this is the way God gave you miracles. He healed you. He did stuff for you. No strings attached. Why all of a sudden now you're believing there are some strings attached to this offer? So he says the leaven spreads through the lump. The little bit of the leaven leavens the whole lump. Well, that's an idiom again. What he's trying to say is this teaching is starting to infect everything within your life. You have reviewed and rethought about the things that you believe and how you live your lives now because of this teaching. So Shaul says in verse 10 that he hopes that they will see this. They will see what's happening to them and reject this teaching. And the one that confuses them is supposed to be judged. It's supposed to be judged. Which is not like a judicial judgment, by the way, don't think about that. What he's trying to say is that a person has to be determined to be untrue and therefore bear the consequences of being that kind of teacher that confuses people. So, okay. So verse 11, look at this. In verse 11, Shaul says that he does not preach circumcision. Wait a minute, we just talked about this. This has to be understood properly. He does not preach circumcision for Gentiles. That's what he's trying to say. For Jews, yes. For Gentiles, no. He does not preach circumcision for Gentiles. He does not see the need of making Gentiles into Jews. Because in his theology, Gentiles are the fulfillment of Abrahamic covenant. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, if the families of the earth become Jews, then the covenant cannot be fulfilled. Abrahamic promise cannot have its final stages if everybody who's not Jewish becomes Jewish. So in this sense, he doesn't preach circumcision to the non-Jews, and in this sense he becomes a renegade from the traditional doctrines, and that is why he's being persecuted. He's going against modern-day Judaism on this one particular issue. He sees a new way for Gentiles in faith that others do not see. Remember the whole experience on the road to Damascus? What was that all about? That was about showing him the new way. What God has done for the Gentiles. That's what he saw. That's why he withdrew. That's why when he came back, he says, that's going to be my job. That's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be preaching the gospel to the nations. Why? Because God showed him a revelation of how God is going to use the nations and how the plan of God is going to work in the end with Israel and everybody else, all congruently. So basically what he says that I don't preach circumcision, and that offends people. That's the offense of the cross right here. That's the stumbling block. That righteousness does not depend on us, but on God and His work. That's what he's saying. That's the message that's really hard for people to accept. Because you see, circumcision, that's the natural way. That's what everybody's doing it. And Joel says, no, it's not necessary. Because God is saying in spirit straight into people's hearts. And He's regenerating from the inside out without circumcision. So, that's what he's saying. It's not necessary. And that doesn't sit well with people who are following traditional thinking. He becomes a renegade in that particular doctrine. And so remember all these discussions about the faithfulness of Messiah in the previous chapters. That's what it's all about. People stumble over this because it takes us out of equation. It takes us out. We just have to trust God. And that's how we get the fullness of the promise. Jews and Gentiles. But you see, Jews are used to the Gentiles becoming Jews. And that's how they would get included into the covenant. Shaul sees a new paradigm. And nobody else sees it at this point yet. And that's why he says, I'm being persecuted. So he says in verse 12 that those who are troubling Galatians, these false teachers, or we don't know how many of them, sometimes he talks about them in plural, or just now he talked about a person in a singular way. So it says that they should mutilate themselves. That's a tough one. This is a pun. This is a pun. This is a direct pun. He's actually implying that they should circumcise themselves a little bit too far and cut off their genitals. Scary stuff. But the pun should make sense to you if you remember what I told to you last week. Do you remember I told you about who the Celts, the people who populated the territory of Galatia, worshipped? That they worshipped the mother goddess, Meter. Meter was worshipped in a traditional pagan way, but remember the priests of the Meter who were called Gali. What did the priests do to themselves to show their devotion to the mother goddess? They castrated themselves. And that's exactly what Shaul says they should do. He says these people who are trying to circumcise you and mess with you, they should just might as well join that cult and go and do what they've always done and just castrate themselves. See, he's taking the negative imagery that Galatians have in their mind of those pagan priests castrating themselves in worship to the mother goddess, and he's relating it to people who are presumably his opponents in an argument right here. So it's very crude. Very crude. But remember, that's what he's trying to do. He's a very crude pun, and he's trying to achieve a little theological victory here in a variety of ways. All right, so let's keep going. Let's not dwell too much on mutilation. Verse 13 through 15. Let's read those. For you were called to freedom, brethren. Only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. Interesting. Apparently Galatians had some problems. And right here, Shaul can't help himself. He gets a little bit preachy. He starts talking about their problems. They have fighting going on. So all this theological letter all of a sudden changes into how you should live your life letter for just a moment in this juncture. So verse 13, he tells them that they were called to freedom. Let's look at that. We already understand that. They were called to be mature, not to be bound by this system of rules, not to serve the system. But the lack of commandments, the lack of the system sometimes has a negative effect. Just because they're not bound to the system of rules, that doesn't mean that they're free from observing the principles that these rules are teaching. See, the negative effect is that in our natural state, in the flesh, we can get a little bit egotistic. We can get insensitive. We can do all kinds of things towards other people. And the lack, for the Galatians, they're not answering to these numerous commandments of the Torah. Does not mean that they do not need to uphold the Torah's main general principles. Those are true pretty much for everyone. And so the main general principle that Shaul brings out here is the law of love. The law, he says, is fulfilled in one word. What he means by that is not one word, and then he quotes the whole verse. How is that going to work? Well, you understand it's an idiom. What he's trying to say is in this one statement, in this one simple truth. This is a principle that he talks about. The word davar, means matter, and so is logos in the Greek the same way. It means not just a word, like a word, but it also means matter. So it's a little bit broader than our English word. So what he says is that the entire Torah stands on one principle of love. The motivation for following Torah is love, and loving others is the measure by which one sees if one actually follows Torah. Let's think about it for a second. That's what really he's talking about. He's not talking about all you need to do is fulfill one commandment by loving people, and the rest of the Torah is irrelevant. No, all 613 commandments are relevant, but they all are bound by one simple topic of love. Remember, Yeshua did the same thing. He says, love God, love your neighbor. They're commandments that they're obligate us towards God, and so we show our devotion and love to God by fulfilling those that obligate us towards God, and they're commandments that obligate us to our fellow men. We show our love and devotion to God, again, by acting in a certain way in accordance with what God said that we should act towards our fellow men. So, and that's how we show our obedience to Torah is by love. Because if, in the end, root, all these commandments really talk about love. That's the motivation behind keeping any of them, actually. So that's what he's saying. And then verse 15 shows that they're fighting among themselves, trying to devour each other, ignoring the very core of Torah. So here's the irony. See, Shaul is bringing out the irony. These people want to follow Torah. They want to get circumcised. They want to be Jewish, but they don't understand the very core ideas of Torah. And one of the main core ideas is love. Love towards one another. The community of the covenant cannot destroy other members of the community of the covenant. Not to say that the world is perfect, that's been a problem all along, but you understand the ideals at least. And that's the irony that Shaul is trying to bring out. So, these verses are pretty easy to understand. Let's move on a little further, 16 through 18. Shaul continues, but I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. For the flesh sets desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. So now you understand why these verses are all of a sudden critical again, because here's another set of verses that usually gets twisted and misshapen and misunderstood by people in a variety of different ways. And the key to understanding these verses is so simple. It's all in the terminology. The terminology that we've talked about, slavery, freedom, flesh, spirit. Verses 16 through 18 sometimes simply are unintelligible to people because they don't understand what Shaul means by these words. People read these verses and Bible teachers are forced to produce very lofty explanations of these words, but it's really actually so simple. Remember, Shaul uses these words, the simple words that you and I know and use all the time, every single day. He uses them in a different way. If we catch what he means by those words, then we will understand what he's trying to say. It becomes clear. So it doesn't matter what these words mean to us. You and I have different connotations about words. What matters is what they mean to him, and they will provide the key to us to understanding his truth. So, for Shaul, Spirit is the sign of promise. Remember, the covenant of Abraham. Spirit is the end result. It's the sign of sonship. It's the sign of those to whom the promise applies. It's the sign of those who receive the Spirit, they receive the inheritance. Because that's the inheritance, that's the fulfillment of the promise, is the fullness of walking with God in His presence and having God living with you and in you. That's what Abraham gets promised. That's what many of the prophets predict. So, in prophets, as we read the prophets, the Spirit is what's being poured out upon people in the end days, right? That's what they're experiencing. The culmination of God's promises, the end time blessing that's being poured out upon people is the Spirit. Whether you read Joel or other prophets or Isaiah, that's what you hear. So for Shaul, Spirit is the proof of maturity. It is the fact that we reach the stage where God places Torah right into our hearts. In Jeremiah 31 says that God will place Torah, He will place His laws, His commandments into our hearts. How does Hashem do that? Through the Spirit. It's supernatural. You can't just take the scroll and eat it and all of a sudden inside you. No, you have to have God's Spirit dwelling within you, and that's the only way you get Torah written on your heart. And then your motivation for following Torah changes because you have God in your life, and you experience that love. And all of a sudden, you're not following Torah because it is some religion or system, or all of a sudden it becomes an expression of love. Your motivation following Torah changes and you know these commandments intuitively because they're written upon your heart. You just know that what you're doing is right. You just know that what you're doing is wrong. Why? Because the Spirit within you testifies of these things. So it is supernatural, and that Spirit is the fulfillment. It's the final stage. It's what Jeremiah talks about, what Joel talks about. And for Shaul, it's happening now. Remember, Shaul is an apocalyptic Jew. He thinks in eschatological terms. He thinks that the prophecies are coming true right now. He's no different than many other Jews of his age. You know, when Yochanan writes Revelation, that's what he's talking about. The things are happening right now. To him, it's all unfolded before his face. So, flesh, by the way, right here, we're looking at these flesh and spirit. Flesh is complementary from the Spirit. It's complementary to the Spirit. It's different from the Spirit. Often it is the opposite of the Spirit. But don't think of it as being contrary. Think of it as being complementary. They need each other, really. Remember, it's not something bad or evil. Shaul doesn't think, and Jews never think, that flesh is bad or evil. Dualists, some Greco-Roman thought may believe that spirit is good and flesh is evil. Jews don't think flesh is evil, so it's not necessarily evil. It's neutral, if anything. It is the natural way. Flesh is the natural way. It's essential. It's something that you're born with. It's ordinary. Okay, flesh is ordinary. There's nothing supernatural about it. Flesh is the realm of touching and feeling, something that a person embraces to be true because it can be experienced, it can be proven. It's a routine. It's a pattern. It's a system by which people simply live out their lives, and a system by which world functions. It's a limited understanding. Flesh is a limited understanding of the world because it is lacking the awareness of the Spirit. And this world is not simply a fleshly touch and feel world. The world is bigger than that. Humans are a combination of two, spirit and flesh. And we will never understand what it truly means to be human, unless we embrace our spiritual side. If we simply think of ourselves as a bag of bones, as flesh and blood, then that's what we are, but we're missing that spiritual side of us. And we will never understand what it truly means to be a whole human being unless we embrace that spiritual side of us. So that's why all the religions in the world, that's actually what they're trying to do, is they're trying to figure out that spiritual side to their existence. Well, flesh is that which is seen in our existence, but there's something more besides the flesh, and that is the Spirit. So you see, the flesh and spirit are related. They're sometimes opposite and work in different ways, but they're not necessarily antithetical to each other. We need both to be whole and complete. Now let's look at how it all makes sense. Verse 16 says that walk by the Spirit, right? Walk by the Spirit, meaning you walk in reality of spiritual life, in reality of God's presence. That's what it means to walk by the Spirit. When you do this, the desire to be natural, to be fleshly, to follow the pattern set by the world would not be there. When you choose to walk by the Spirit, the desires of the flesh all of a sudden are there. You want to be supernatural in all things you do. So Shaul basically says, live supernaturally. Live supernaturally, acknowledging God's reality. That's what it means to live by the Spirit. Look at verse 17. The flesh offers a natural path of navigating life, making decisions, getting things done in this world. The Spirit offers a different way. An awareness of the other world, the non-fleshly world, it causes one to make very different decisions, guided by our understanding of this world. And that is why, they are really opposite in some ways. Each one is trying to shape our reality and offers us options. The way of the Spirit shapes our reality of the spiritual life, and now we're making decisions based on what we understand about the spiritual life that we're experiencing. And our natural inclinations tend to push us in a different way. We're basing our reality of a natural reality. So you and I are caught between these two realities, constantly listening to one side and to the other. And that's why decision-making can be so difficult, especially for a person who realizes that that is where we're caught. There's a tension between the spirit and the flesh at all times. In verse 18, we see that Shaul says that if we are led by the Spirit, meaning we choose to acknowledge the spiritual reality, we're taking into account the spiritual matters of life, then we're not under the law. Do you see that? How is that possible? If we simply acknowledge the spiritual things, we're not under Torah. You see, Torah was designed to make us aware of God and His laws, His morals, His ethics, His priorities. The purpose of Torah is to help us understand these things. If we are aware of the reality, then Torah has done its job. And then we are mature enough to live in that truth. The Torah has fulfilled this task of teaching us, training us, guiding us, educating us, making us aware to the reality that is God and His world and existence beyond our fleshly desires. So when it's done its job, we don't have to be guided by it anymore. Not that it's not important anymore, the principles of Torah continue to guide us. They continue to provide us some leading in our lives. But we do not need Torah as a tutor. We don't need to be held by the hand all the time. We are mature to make our own right decisions because we know what is right. We don't need to be constantly reminded and instructed what is right. So we're no longer under the jurisdiction of the Torah. We don't need a babysitter. We can stay home alone and we can be trusted because we know the right path. So we have the Spirit and we have the Torah, and that's God's Torah is etched in our hearts. The Spirit usually confirms the Torah. So now we have a guide and teacher within us. You see, things are changing. Now we are ready for the list of famous fruits of the flesh and the Spirit. So I know I'm laying a lot on you today, but I promised I was going to do a whole chapter. So let's do the list. And trust me, it's not as complicated as it looks. So let's read verses 19 through 23. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and all things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Okay, so here we are. We read the list. Here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to go over all the items on the list one by one because number one, it'll take us forever. Number two, it's actually not necessary. I want you to look at them as a group. That's not the point. The list is instructive. It's supposed to teach us something. But the reason why Shaul puts this list of items is to make a point, to make an impact. He has to stress, he has to emphasize something. That's why he makes a list. Lists are powerful. When you list a whole bunch of things together, it makes an impact upon you. You're saying, wow, look at all this evidence. It's impressive. It's hard to refute. You have to argue with point by point. So please notice one major difference between these two lists. A list of good things, a list of bad things, right? This is the major difference. This is very crucial. The deeds of the flesh are all reflected in the Torah in a very clear way. Everything on that list, the Torah talks about in a very clear and precise way. There are numerous explicit commandments that prohibit such behaviors in the Torah itself. These are the fruits of the living in a fleshly, natural, it feels good, therefore I want to do it life. This is what it is. This is our natural inclination. And these are the things that Torah prohibits. All of them are expressly forbidden in Torah. Torah steers people away from living in the ways of the flesh by basically stating a higher standard, right? It leads you away from that. In a sense, Torah limits the flesh. In a sense, Torah limits us, our natural tendencies. It says, I know you want to do this. Don't. Because there's something you don't understand. Although it feels good, it's actually not good for you. It's like a nanny, like a tutor, like a teacher, who puts us in timeout, who spanks us, who punishes us to make us better people when we grow up. Right? I'm sure my kids would love a whole bag of candy. But I just know it's not good for them. Even though it feels good when they're eating it first. But I just know it. Why? Because there's some things I understand they simply don't understand yet. And so this is how we are with Torah. Torah limits our freedom. No, you can't. You can have one, but that's no more. That's it. Because more than one's going to be bad for you. Okay. This is the role of Torah. And Torah presupposes, actually, an immature person who needs to be guided away from the behavior that comes to us naturally. That's why everything on that bad list is actually prohibited in Torah in a very expressed way. But verse 21 says that the people who live this way will not inherit the kingdom of God. Wow, Torah is important then. You can't just say, okay, love, 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 all we need is love. Look at that song, right? I love you, you love me, we're a happy family, whatever song you want to borrow from whatever repertoire. The point is, no, it takes a little bit further than that. Okay, Torah is important. Yes, because if a person lives this way, he's living the way of the flesh. If he's living in the way of flesh, what is he showing by his life? That he's denying the spiritual way. And that means that he doesn't actually have a relationship with God, because he doesn't understand that he's a spiritual person. So he lives in a fleshly way, follows the fleshly ways, refuses to try to even move in the direction of a spiritual life, and doesn't understand what a spiritual life is, and doesn't probably even understand that there is such a thing as a spiritual world. So I see that's why Torah is supposed to lead you towards understanding of reality of a spiritual life. And when it has done that, it has fulfilled its job. But you see, a person who lives this way is an immature person in the sense that that's what he needs. He needs guidance. And that's why he will not inherit the kingdom of God. Because why would God give his kingdom, the ultimate manifestation of his reality and presence, to a person who doesn't even acknowledge that he's a spiritual human being? He has no connection with God at all. So why should he inherit something that is intended for those who do? Again, you probably heard other explanations, but hopefully this one makes sense. So, it's not about being a bad boy. It's really living fleshly way because you don't have a relationship with God. How else would you live? Why would you care to do spiritual things if you don't know God or love God? So it's about priority. Okay, verses 22 through 24. Look at this. They describe the fruits of the Spirit. And what we are seeing here is that clearly Torah does not prohibit any of this. Nor does it actually command any of these things explicitly. This entire list, you look through it, Torah does not tell you these things explicitly. It does say it implicitly. That means you have to actually read Torah, understand the bigger picture behind the stories that Torah tells, behind the morals it tells you through, whether it be through commandments or stories or examples or case laws, whatever it is. But you kind of have to dig to those meanings to understand that all these things is what God wants. And in a sense, if you think about these attributes, if you think about this list, this is God himself. These ideas, God reflects in his own being. And there's no prohibitions, but there's no directions. There are directions, but they're not very clear. They're kind of require you to look beyond the text a little bit. Look behind the story for the moral. So those who are in touch with the spiritual reality, with the world that is supernatural, exhibit these traits. Why? Because these traits are very important in the supernatural world. That's who God is, so they kind of learn by emulating the object of their faith. And there's no commandments against these things. As Shaul says, the Spirit is not antithetical to Torah. See this? The Spirit is not antithetical to Torah. These things are connected to each other. Not at all. Not antithetical. See, Torah is designed to limit us. That is why, by the way, Shaul refers to it by the image of slavery. But remember, it's not bad and evil. Slavery is actually not bad and evil. If you remember, for Shaul, slavery is not a negative image. Shaul lives in a society in which slavery is a part of a society. And he never actually condones it. Not in one of his epistles, not in one of his letters, he actually says, "You bad slave owners." He never says that. Because he is accepted, he lives in a society that slavery is simply an institution, and it is a structure, it is a function. He doesn't seem to judge it. So for him, slavery is not bad. See, for you and I, when we hear the word slavery, we're thinking about people being sold off and persecuted and killed and led away and all kinds of terrible things and atrocities, because you and I are familiar with only one kind of form of slavery, which has happened in this country. Okay, or maybe some other recent things of slavery that we know. But you see, he's not talking about slavery in that way. So for him, living in slavery is not necessarily a bad thing. It's limited. It's not ideal. It's not the fullness of freedom. Freedom is fullness. Freedom is the best that it can ever get. Slavery is still pretty good because you're protected, you're fed, you're clothed, you have a job, you have a purpose, you serve somebody. But it's not the best, because the best would be if you were able to do all those things and you were free, because then you could do whatever you want. But you're here, you're bound to your master. You don't have all the freedoms. You can't move halfway around the world. You can't open your own business and decide to do something else with your life because you are answerable to your master. So slavery and freedom, are not seen by Shaul in the same exact way that we see them, but I just want you to see that. However, it is a system. It is a system that limits us in many ways. It protects us from our own destructive behaviors. Think about it this way. A person who's not mature needs it. A person who is mature can transcend it. You can go forward because it's fulfilled its function. It taught you the wisdom that you need to know. So now the final verses. We'll get into the end of the chapter. 24 through 26. Now those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. Let us not become boastful, challenging one another, envying one another. Shaul says that those who belong to Yeshua, very clearly here, they died with him. Not a new imagery. He's used this in other places, in other letters. Their flesh died. Their desires of the flesh died as well. So now they're living. They died to a natural way of life, and they're living a supernatural way. Even though their bodies are still alive, what he's saying, I want you to live the life as if your body's actually died. Even though you're still alive. But I want you to pretend that your body's died with Yeshua. That's what he's saying. Crucifying the flesh, all that, this is what he's talking about. If one is alive by the virtue of the Spirit, then one should live in the way the Spirit leads. Not as the flesh lives. Not in a naturalistic way. That's what we should try to follow. So in verse 26, Shaul essentially calls for unity among Galatians. They should love each other as Torah implies. That's really all that he's trying to say in these verses. These verses are not that complicated at all. But when we go into next week, we may still run into a few places that are complicated. So here we are. We finished this chapter. Hopefully it was illuminating and you were able to navigate a few places that are kind of a little bit touchy and sometimes get twisted by different people. Hopefully I gave you a perspective that maybe is fresh and new for you, and maybe you were already reaffirmed in that which you understood from the book of Galatians anyway. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.